Okay, and we are continuing straight from the last video.
Now you can say to me, look, James, fair enough, but look, surely this is an outlier. You're cherry-picking the most extreme example in order to rubbish the whole process. That's what you're doing. The research basis for the others disorders was far more robust. Now, if you were to make that argument, that would be a fair argument to make. So let me deal with it now. And I'm going to deal with it by inviting into the discussion somebody called Dr. Theodore Millen. And by the way, Dr. Theodore Millen was a member of the original task force, so he was privy to everything that went on. In the following quote, this is what he says about the research not only supporting the inclusion of SDPD, but all of the other disorders that went into DSM. This is what he
All the disorders that went into the DSM.
says. There was very little systematic research, and much of the research that existed was really a hodgepodge, scattered, inconsistent, and ambiguous. I think the majority of us recognize that the amount of good, solid science upon which we were making our decisions was pretty modest.
So the fun thing with the serpent is, how does a serpent talk? And not only that, but why is the serpent's punishment?
So let me now go back to sitting in Robert Spitzer's front room back in Princeton. I decide to read to Robert this quote to see what he made of it. And after a short and a slightly uncomfortable silence, Robert Spitzer responded in a way I simply had not expected. He said the following: "Well, it is certainly true that for many of the disorders that were added, there wasn't a tremendous amount of research. And certainly there wasn't research on the particular way we define these disorders. In the case of Millen's quote, I think he's mainly referring to the personality disorders. But again, it is certainly true that the amount of research validating data on most psychiatric disorders is very limited indeed." So you're saying that there was little research not only supporting your inclusion of new disorders, but also supporting how these disorders should be defined? There are very few disorders whose definition was a result of specific research data.
Guys, this is the head guy, the head psychiatrist in the whole fucking world that was in charge of putting together the Bible for psychiatry. He just admitted there was very little research done on any of these disorders. This is heresy. This is abuse. These people should be strung up in the whole psychiatry field, thrown into the trash because of this.
So I was so surprised by this admission that when I returned to the UK some days later, I decided to check it out with other members of his task force. So on a rainy English morning, I decided to call at his office in New York City someone called Professor Donald Klein. Now, Professor Donald Klein is a really important figure in the history of DSM. He was second in command to Robert Spitzer, but actually from the archives, it turns out he probably had, in many areas, almost more influence than Robert Spitzer. So a key player in the history of DSM.
Guys, he's talking to the top dogs in psychiatry in the whole fucking world and getting it straight from the horse's mouth.
I called him and I read to him what Spitzer had said to me to see what he made of it. And this is how he responded. "Sure, we had very little in the way of data, so we were forced to rely on clinical consensus, which, admittedly, is a very poor way to do things. But it was better than anything else we had. So, without data to guide you, how was this consensus reached?" I asked for an example. "We thrashed it out, basically. We had a 3-hour argument. There would be about 12 people sitting down at a table. Usually there was a chairperson and there was somebody taking notes. And at the end of each meeting, there would be a distribution of events. And at the next meeting, some would agree with the inclusion and others would continue arguing. If people were still divided, the matter would be eventually decided by a vote."
By a vote. Guys, they are arguing. These guys don't even agree. They're arguing and then they vote. They are playing with your lives. They don't give a fuck about anything other than their self-righteous importance, their social status.
"A vote? Really? Sure, that is how it went." So they're voting here. I'm interested. So the next person I speak to, Dr. Henry Pinsker, again, a member of the original 9, I decide to raise the issue of voting with him. And this is what he said. Some things were discussed over a number of different meetings, which would sometimes be followed by an exchange of memoranda about it. And then there would simply be a vote. People would raise hands. There weren't that many people.
Oh my God. He justified it by saying there weren't that many people, so they could easily count hands. I mean, these guys are disgusting, man. And you all are disgusting for letting them be authorities over you. People are laughing, guys. People with common sense are laughing at these cocksuckers.
Legitimacy of this method, Pinsker continues.
You know why? Because, guys, anybody with common sense knows this isn't right. We could pull 10 people from the general population and they would understand this and be able to fix the psychiatry industry better than these cocksuckers.
We never had any question that that was how we should proceed. I had no reservations at all about working that way. And just to confirm this was the case, when I was in the archives, I managed to source with the archivist 12 minuted task force meetings. And we could only source 12 because that's all we could find. And out of those 12 minuted task force meetings, there is evidence, clear evidence, of votes taking place in 10 of them. And we're not talking about 1 or 2 votes here. Lots and lots of votes on a whole host of different topics. In one of the documents, there was about 24 votes on loads of different things. How to define the disorders, where to set symptom thresholds, whether or not to include the disorders.
Guys, they are not using scientific reasoning. They are voting. They are going off of their own egos. This is not right. This is completely wrong. This is abuse. This is illusory.
In other words, the archival evidence absolutely supports what the oral history is saying. Oh, one point I just want to make about all of this. Voting isn't scientific activity.
This isn't funny.
What is it? It's a cultural activity. When anything is voted into existence, whatever it may be, whether it's a new president of the United States, whether it's a new union leader, whether or not it's a new mental disorder, the likelihood we've got it wrong is never far away. Okay, so let me give you... yes. Could I just introduce you to Rennie Garfinkel for a moment? Very interesting woman. She joined the construction of DSM5. She'd just finished her training as a psychologist. So she was very young, very green, very naive and innocent, as we all are before we go out there into the big wide world. And she got a kind of internship at the APA. And she turned up one morning and she said, what do I have to do? And they said, oh, there's this thing going on upstairs called the DSM. Could you go up there and just help out, make coffee, photocopy, usual sorts of things? Oh, fine. So she goes there. She doesn't know what she's part of. And she's sitting in the task force meetings. And as things roll on, she starts to realise she's actually part of something quite important here. And she's privy to some quite fascinating dynamics. So, 30 or so years later, I decided to interview her. What was going on? What was happening? What did you observe? This is what she said. You must understand, what I saw happening on these committees wasn't scientific. It more resembled a group of friends trying to decide where they want to go for dinner.
The good old boys, rubbing elbows.
One person says, I feel like Chinese food. Another person says, no, I'm really more in the mood for Indian food. And finally, after some discussion and collaborative give and take, they all decide to go have Italian.
This is
She
disgusting.
then gave me an example of how far down the scale of intellectual respectability she felt these meetings could sometimes fall. On one occasion, I was sitting in on a task force meeting, and there was a discussion about whether a particular behaviour should be classed as a symptom of a particular disorder. And as the conversation went on, to my great astonishment, one task force member suddenly piped up, oh, no, we can't include that behaviour as a symptom, because I do that.
Oh my God, did you hear that? They didn't include a disorder because one of the doctors actually, exhibited that symptom. This is so disgusting. This is slavery. These people shouldn't be laughing.
And so it was decided that behaviour wouldn't be included because presumably if someone on the task force does it, it must be perfectly normal.
Unreal.
All right, so let me just give you some more impressions of these meetings gathered by way of my interviews and other people, other sources I consulted. According to other members of the task force, these meetings were often haphazard affairs. Suddenly these things would happen and there didn't seem to be much basis for it except someone just decided all of a sudden to run with it, said one participant. It seemed, another member admitted, that the loudest voices usually won out. With no extensive data one could turn to, the outcome of task force decisions often depended on who in the room had the strongest personality. But the problem with relying on consensus, reiterated Garfinkel, is that in the discussion, some voices will just get quieter, either because they don't want to fight or because they see they're in the minority.
Don't you see? Survival of the fittest. Dog eat dog. May the best man win. That's how your medical and psychiatry industry is, guys.
And snap. That's when the decision is made. Admittedly, when the task force lacked expertise on a particular disorder, Spitzer would consult the relevant leaders in the field, and the archives are full of these letters he was writing back and forth to the experts. But this also led to chaotic meetings that members often found difficult to participate in. One of the only British members of the task force, a psychiatrist called David Schaffer, recalled how such meetings often unfolded. In these meetings of the so-called experts or advisors, people would be standing and sitting and moving around. People would talk on top of each other, but Robert Spitzer, would be too busy typing notes to chair the meeting in an orderly way. Now, in 2005, a very interesting article was published in the New Yorker magazine, and the title of that article was A Dictionary of Disorder, and it was a biographical study of Robert Spitzer's influence on global psychiatry. And midway through that article, there's a section on the construction of DSM-3, which I just want to read to you very briefly. Roger Peel and Paul Lasada, psychiatrists at St. Elizabeth's Hospital in Washington, D.C., wrote a paper in which they used the term hysterical psychoses to describe the behavior of two kinds of patients they had observed. Spitzer read the paper and asked Peel and Lasada if he could come to Washington to meet them. During a 40-minute conversation, the three decided that hysterical psychoses should really be divided into two disorders: brief reactive psychosis and factitious disorder. Then Bob asked for a typewriter, Peel says. To Peel's surprise, Spitzer drafted the definitions on the spot. He banged out criteria sets for factitious disorder and for brief reactive psychosis, and it struck me that this was a productive fella. He comes in to talk about an issue and walks away with diagnostic criteria for two different mental disorders. And by the way, both of those disorders went into the DSM with only very minor modification from the original criteria written up there and then in that room.
They aren't even thinking about this, guys. They don't give a fuck. They can do whatever. These guys know they can do and get away with whatever they want, because you guys uphold them as authorities and experts, and you listen and you don't care. So why, if you don't care, why the fuck are they gonna care? They don't give a fuck.
Let me just read you two paragraphs before we move on. As Spitzer's DSM-3 was published in 1980, it became a sensation overnight. The almost 500-page long manual sold out immediately. The manual was purchased not only by psychiatrists, but by nurses, social workers, lawyers, psychologists, psychotherapists, etc. And the enthusiasm quickly spread far beyond the United States. In Britain, for example, the manual had such impact that by the end of the 1980s, most British psychiatrists were being trained to use DSM. Furthermore, Spitzer's DSM categories quickly became those that guided all research into psychiatric disorders internationally. This meant that the disorders that were studied by researchers in Germany, Australia, Canada, Britain, Scandinavia, and so on and so forth, were those defined and listed in Spitzer's DSM. In short, the book ultimately changed the fundamental nature of research and practice within the field, not to mention the lives of tens of countless millions diagnosed with the psychiatric disorders listed therein. And yet, as the influence of the manual spread, the truth about its construction remained obscure. Most professionals using the manual simply did not know, and I would say still do not know today, the extent to which biological evidence or solid research failed to guide the choices the task force made. They did not know that the definitions of the disorders contrived, the validity of the disorders included, and the symptom thresholds people must meet in order to receive the diagnosis were not decided on the basis of rigorous research, but were the product of committee decisions which, at best, reflected the well-meaning professional opinions of a small subset of psychiatrists. In short, most people did not know that the fundamental changes Spitzer brought to global psychiatry only required the consensus of an extremely small group of people. 9 people.
And we'll stop there. I recommend you guys watching this whole video. You can go under and read the comments underneath are great. But yeah, just proving, I mean, there's your proof. So 9 people in the whole world out of 7 billion people, 9 people, self-righteous, self-important, self-appointed, egotistical, tyrannical cocksuckers put together a book in the 80s, and then the whole fucking medical industry, you heard him talk about all the dozens of fields that bought, it was a bestseller. And everybody since then has based their findings and what they do and how they administer medicines, etc., off of these idiots, these good old boys who sat around in these meetings eating and drinking and having fun and doing nothing but stroking each other's egos. That is what they're basing all of their treatment for their patients on. This is disgusting. This is abuse. This is illusory. This is superfluous. Wake up, reclaim your authority, understand that you are being abused.